After the sweeping success of 1951, the Aurora Space Program kicked off the year with a bang, with the flight of the XSR-2 Flight B. Upon having gathered most of the scientific data from the upper atmosphere, the XSR-2 detached its command module and descended under parachute. The scientists, eager to understand more about our planet, came up with new experiments that they would research and plan for their future flights. Within the administration building, new contractors were selected to assist in the production of flight vehicles and missions. Both JPL were selected for their speed and integration of vehicles, and Rocketdyne for their speed and research of new rocket engines. Meanwhile, the administrators researched future contract requirements to understand a new mission plan for each of our rockets going forward. On January 20th, 1952, the RP-1 would be rolled out to the pad. This would be Flight A for the prospective rocket. This rocket is largely based on early designs of the V2 and the A4 rocket. Designed to take film canisters up into space, this rocket would be the first to return film from those canisters. Unfortunately, due to a failure in the engine, it resulted in a performance loss for the rocket. The rocket would never reach its intended altitude, but the scientists felt that it was important to let it keep running in order to gather as much data for the rocket after the fact. Upon reaching the maximum altitude, the camera would be opened and tested, collecting film along the way. While the rocket's mission was unfortunately a failure, it would at least be a good test for future missions to come. The Ahote's command module would be recovered under parachute just outside of the launch center. On February 13, 1952, the XSR-3 would take flight. This is a new sounding rocket designed with a payload capacity for sounding payloads. These payloads would be given out in contracts to universities or schools across the country, anyone seeking to do experiments within the vastness of space. While the rocket would be a failure, not reaching its intended altitude, and not burning for the correct period of time, this again would be another test bed for future missions. We attempted to recover the entire rocket under parachute, and we will learn a few things about the aerodynamics of rocket vehicles and the recovery process going on forward. unfortunately would perform exactly as a dart would and shot right into the ground, breaking apart our parachute and crashing. On February 27, 1952, we brought out a new plane. This one is still the Kawak XJ-1, but we've added a couple new features to it. We've strapped early XSR-1 rockets underneath the wings, this time attaching the XASR Mark II variant of the Aerobee engine. The point of these missions would be to test out rocket planes, test out the stresses on the airframe of a Kawak XJ-1, and to test out pilots' responsiveness under rocket stresses. Going forward, if pilots are to reach new heights, they're going to need to be able to pilot planes or vehicles under rocket power. And thus, the plane is designed to bring a rocket engine up to the required height, ignite the engines, and then fly off to the maximum height of the cockpit. In for this flight is Ernest Hall, the Daredevil pilot, once again. And while we haven't quite forgiven him for his previous excitement with the Kawak, we figured this would be the perfect test for Ernest, giving him the control of an exciting aircraft, an exciting new aircraft pushing the boundaries of aerospace technology. Once we reached the proper height, Ernest turned around to take a hard bank towards the Space Center, flying over the Space Center when the rockets ignited so that folks on the ground could get a really good view of the engines in flight. This would be important for collecting scientific data later on. Unfortunately, only one of our rocket engines ignited, an unfortunate fact of the Aerobee engines, and we would learn that this was later due to dynamic pressures on the engine systems, giving them a lower percentage chance to ignite. In future missions, this would have to be rectified, forcing pilots to ignite their engines at a much higher altitude, ideally above 10 kilometers. And here Ernest is taking a quick dive straight back down, attempting to go as fast as possible, breaking the sound barrier once again on his way down. His flight capped out at approximately Mach 1.11 before he had to pull up and bank away from the water to save his plane. Ernest this time tried to manage the stresses on the airframe just so that way the administrators didn't get quite as mad at him. However, this time, this dive was not just one of Ernest's maneuvers, it was a scheduled test on the airframe to see the limits of our jet engine with its maximum intake. At this point, we're still developing those air brakes. We can't figure out the proper strength ratio to add air brakes to our planes, and so they are still under development. However, in order to bleed speed early on, since he was coming in at quite a high velocity, Ernest did a couple tail swipes into the wind to bleed speed. Only 5 Gs were acquired, only 5 Gs were maintained during those tail swipes, and Ernest came down for a very gentle and successful touchdown. Following the success, March 19th, 1952 saw the next flight of the XSR-3. This would be Flight B, and this one would have an actual mission to accompany it. We took on a mission from a college, and they wanted us to send 75 units of sounding payload into the upper atmosphere. 80 kilometers was our destination, and we would attempt to reach it on this mission. This Aerobee variant performed exactly as we had hoped, reaching the required altitude and burning for the full length, utilizing all of its fuel. The sounding payload would reach the high altitude that was required, above 80 kilometers, about 7 kilometers higher than that requirement. While this is just a little bit over the contract's requirement, it's good to continue to reach higher and higher as we move forward with the Aurora Space Program. There you can see we deployed the command module. The command module would reach its required altitude and then return safely under parachute a few minutes later. On April 24th, we had the following flight of the RP-1. This is Flight B, still using the A4 engine. Launching upwards into the sky, the RP-1 would see a pretty successful mission. This time we hope to reach an altitude of 100 kilometers with a downrange distance of 200 kilometers. This is a requirement by the Air Force and the Army, and they are attempting to test out the ability to take pictures of the Earth from the altitude of space. 100 kilometers, of course, being the Kármán line, and 200 kilometers downrange being an exceptional distance. The point of this mission is to test out the ability to fly over targets downrange and then recover the payload with the film taken after the fact. Though the flight was largely successful, the pitch over program was not implemented in a proper manner, and though the rocket would reach the required height, it never reached the required downrange distance for the contract to be fulfilled, and thus the contract would have to be postponed for the next launch of the RP-1. On January 7th, 1952, Stacy Wood would get his chance to fly the rocket plane test, taking off from the KSC runway. I don't know if you have noticed, but across the course of all of the takeoffs, our takeoffs have been getting gentler and gentler. Something that you'll note about the Quark XJ1 is that it has very large control surfaces. And here you can see that both rockets ignited perfectly, launching the plane forward at an increased rate. And they burnt out after expending all of their fuel. Stacy would then drop off those tanks after having reached the highest altitude for this cockpit and dive back down below the surface, the altitude limit for this cockpit. This altitude limit for the cockpit was discovered to be 16 kilometers. And in order to save himself from hypoxia, Stacy would have to dive back down. And once again, testing out the limits of the jet engine. However, after learning from Ernest's test, we learned to keep the jet engine at about a third thrust all the way down through a dive like that. Largely because when the engine intake is taking in a lot of extra air, it tends to heat up the engine to an amount that it cannot withstand. This being a very early jet engine, we want to try and keep that engine heating down to the lowest amount possible. And here Stacy's making a very hard bank to try and bleed some of that speed off coming in for the landing. And we're going to come in for the landing on the NACA runway. Very long, good for a rocket plane, considering that they want to have the maximum distance for that. Also considering that we don't have a parachute for this plane or any air brakes. Something's still under development. You can see we had a little bit of a bounce there. Fortunately, our gear have a pretty high spring ratio. I like to keep the plane very high above the ground, protect that air intake on the ground. After that flight, we had the Flight C of the Ojote-1 on July 13th. Very auspicious. This was our second attempt, our third attempt actually, at completing that downrange film contract. I think the Army would be very upset with us if we did not complete it. This time we pitched over at approximately 100 meters per second instead of waiting for about 200 meters per second. This would give us the proper pitch angle to actually start changing our velocity into horizontal velocity, something that we neglected to do last time. The A4 engine performed exactly as ordered, and the rocket enters an uncontrolled spin after the burnout of the A4. Luckily, we are not attempting to reach orbit or anything like that, because the pressure differences on the rocket would not allow it to do so if we really wanted to. Upon decoupling the fairing, we sent the rocket up a little bit further by detaching the command module on a slingshot up into the sky. Here you can see we're collecting film data and we're doing the perfect amount of flyover distance, reaching 200 kilometers before we descend back down under parachute. Thankfully, the oblong shape of this command module has given it something of a lifting body effect. And while that is not exactly what we desired for it, we expected it to perform like the original XSR 1, 2, and 3 command modules. This is a little bit better because the film canister we would not like to be on the bottom of the flight when it's coming back down through the atmosphere. And here we have August 14th, the second launch of an XSR-3. This is going to be Flight C. So I guess that makes it the third launch, excuse me. And we're going to put another payload up there for another university. How kind we are at Aurora Space Program to be able to do that for our universities here in America. And the rocket reaches its desired altitude, pushing the boundaries once again and allowing us to get that payload up into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the Aurora Space Program has already collected all of the data that we were going to get from the upper atmosphere. The next area that we would need to look is going to be actually outer space, and thus we decided not to bring back the data. Now, here in November, we have the XSR-4 Flight A, a new sounding rocket variant using the XLR-10. This would be a controlled sounding rocket, attempting to test out the limits of our control on a smaller rocket. As you may have noted, the RP-1 was a controlled rocket as well, but this time we are attempting to do so on a much smaller launch vehicle, and thus we created a new pad called the XSR Heavy Launch Pad, and we're attempting to fly this vehicle up to the maximum height. The XLR-10 uses an ethanol 90 mixture as well, which is a bit different than our Aerobee engines, and so we're testing out different fuels in the process. These missions, although simple, might actually reveal the process that we will need to get further in space. Sounding rockets need to be stacked in order to get further downrange distances, and thus we're testing out the ability to control smaller and smaller rockets with larger and larger fuel tanks. We want to try and avoid having large avionics on any of our missiles, just so that way we can get them a little bit further using as little weight as possible. And you'll note that this one still has a detachable command module, though there won't be much data coming back down from that module. While this mission may not have accomplished any specific goals, we did accomplish one thing. We tested a variant of an engine that we will come to know very soon. This engine would contribute to the construction of its older brother in the following flight. And here we are with the Aurora X1. This is a rocket plane experimental variant. It will be the first of the series that is designed as a rocket plane from the very beginning. This uses the XLR-11 engine. This engine utilizes an ethanol and liquid oxygen mixture to propel our planes to new speeds. Unfortunately, the air brake system has still yet to be worked out. Our strength to mass ratio, we can't quite figure it out just yet. And as such, we have a parachute included on this flight. This parachute could, in theory, lift the plane, the entire weight of the plane, with its dry mass, assuming that the rocket doesn't burn out or anything like that. The entire plane could descend under the weight of the parachute, or under the strength of the parachute. Here we are reaching our desired speed for our contract, our rocket plane contract, and then we subsequently reach our altitude that we were interested in reaching. Here we're going to try and push the plane to its limits, try to reach the highest height possible. As you can see here, we're rapidly approaching the apoapsis of our flight, which ended up being about 27,800 meters above the surface, and we are about to take a dive straight back down to the Space Center. The X1, the Aurora X1, was designed to dive back down through the atmosphere and then come down for a glide, as you can see with its wider wings. It's something of a bridge between the Delta Wing variant of the Kawak XJ1 and the more rudimentary fighter jets of the post-war era. The purpose of this plane is to try and utilize the supersonic technology that we had developed over the past few years, and put that to use in a simple glider essentially, and allow it to come back down at supersonic speeds. We are going to attempt to land on the NACA runway here very shortly, so we'll have to have a bit of a bank. For a moment there, I think Stacy was a little bit afraid, because we're losing altitude rather rapidly, and we're coming in flying almost like a brick as we come into the landing strip. But it looks like we'll just about make it. Here you can see Stacy pulling up some S banks. This would be similar to what you would see in the shuttle in real life as it comes in from the upper atmosphere, but the shuttle would go on a normal glide slope going in to the runway. Fortunately, I don't have any fancy computers that I have to rely on. I just see my airspeed coming into the runway, and I know I've got to drop it before we touch down. And you can see there's the parachutes. They almost pull us up here, and I nose downed really fast because I did not want that to happen. But here we are, perfectly landed. Stacy is an excellent pilot, as you all know, and we are set up to recover this plane for the next flight. So here at the end, we have a little bit of administrative stuff. Sometimes I try to include the science in the narrative, but it's really difficult, I think, because science nodes, that's not how science is done in real life. That's not how research is done in real life. Like, you have a set of objectives and you're like, I want to accomplish them. So then you are like, how can I do that? How can I accomplish that? That's like an engineering objective. And if you're doing scientific stuff, you have a hypothesis and you want to understand the what leads to your hypothesis being correct or wrong or whatever. You try to prove it or disprove it. So like, it doesn't really make sense that there's something called like a science node, and we're researching science nodes. That's pretty neat. So it's difficult to include it in the narrative. But I guess at the end of the episode, another thing that I did want to talk about besides the science nodes, and why I'm not talking about administrative stuff as it's happening, because you can see it, I suppose, is I should talk about the names of my vehicles. So in this year, we've seen the launch of 2 new vehicles. First, we have the Ahote. Ahote is a Hopi word, a Hopi name, actually, from a Native American tribe. It's the Hopi tribe. And it basically means the restless one. And I thought that was like a perfect name for a rocket that's seeking to push the boundaries of what's possible, going on suborbital, bringing things back, doing research for our scientific team. I think it's pretty impressive. So I thought that was a really great name. And the second word we have, it's going to be Kolowa. So like Kolowa is a word, also Hopi word, and it means to soar or to rise, right? So I thought this would be a really good name for our first X-plane, really, because the purpose of those rocket planes is to fly, to get as high as possible and push the boundaries of what is thought to be the limits of mankind. So I felt like, considering we are pushing the boundaries, we're reaching the highest altitude anybody has ever been to, we're reaching the highest speeds anybody has ever been to, I thought that the Kolowa would be a great name for our first X-plane. So yeah, there's a little bit of a explanation as to what my names are. So if you want to see more stuff like that, go ahead and let me know. But if you would rather it be in the video, you can also let me know then. Well, anyways, see, I'm getting to the end here. I wanted to say thank you so much for watching. If you like, please subscribe or like. Also have a comment, and I'll see you all in the next one.